So what we're going to put in our controller are basically our models, and we're going to, again, modify with that scope. And we're going to use data binding to pass whatever we're doing in the controller over to our view or our template. So something that we're going to use that's really important is that scope that you see we passed in before. And what that scope does is it links your controller to your view. So that kind of sounds confusing, but basically, whatever you're going to attach to that scope is going to be made available to your template view as a variable. So similar to what we did before with that ng model, if you apply that ng model with something that is available in the scope, that's going to be able to be used. This is a confusing concept until you see it in action, so we're going to show that in a little bit. But what you want to basically remember is the scope contains all your models for the data that you're going to be using. And the scope is always configured within the controller for that specific section. And every time you're creating a new controller, you're setting basically a new scope inside of that controller and that element that you created that controller for. And so let's talk about displaying and binding data. As you've seen before in our Hello World application, you can display data once you have a model for it just by simply using some double braces. You're going to actually bind that data using directives like what we did before. So what we did was we used ng model for Hello World, and that will create that two-way data binding we talked about, which will basically bind your data from both your view into your controller as well as your controller into your view. So whenever something changes in your view, that changes automatically in our controller as well. And our ng bind is a slightly different function, and that'll basically create one-way data binding. So whatever changes in your controller will actually populate out to your view, but it won't go back the other way. And ng bind is obviously more performant than ng model since it doesn't have to actually create that watching. But we're going to use ng model because when we're populating the form, it's actually going to change the model that we've created in our controller, as you'll see now.
So we're doing two-way data binding.
Yeah, we're going to do two-way data binding. One-way data binding is really useful if you're, for instance, displaying some data out that you fetch from the server that you know isn't necessarily going to change. But especially for something like what we're doing here, where you're going to input data and you want that to be, you want that data to, have some sort of action applied onto it. It's just so useful because you don't have to, pass that data back into your controller. It's already there for you whenever you're changing it.
So it's basically one way is good for displaying, two way is good for user input.
Yeah, exactly. So now what we want to do here is first we want to go into our main controller and we want to start creating some variables on our scope. So the first thing we're going to do is we're actually going to create posts. And we're going to make this an empty array for now. I'm actually going to remember to attach this onto our scope. And we're going to make this an empty array for now. And that'll basically contain all the posts that we're going to display on the page. Once we have a backend, of course, we're going to get our posts from there. But for now, we're just going to start it out empty every time.
Now, when you add stuff to the scope variable, it goes to any other controller that's using it can have access?
No. So the scope that you're creating is only going to be available for whatever you put in your controller here. So, for instance, this div right here, this is... Am I highlighting that correctly? OK, so because we put in our main controller onto this main div, the only things that can access this, the scope variables are going to be inside this div. If, for instance, we had another div down here, and we gave that another controller, then that controller will, then the elements underneath that will only be able to access that controller's own scope.
Its own scope. OK, got it.
Yeah. We're going to talk about root scope a little bit later on, but there is a way to, provide entire scope to your entire module. That shouldn't be used too much. We're going to use it for
globals
one thing
are
at
bad?
the end. Yeah, believe it or not, globals are bad. There's a preferred way to actually pass data around Angular application, and we'll get to that, I think, in Module 5. Meanwhile, we're going to actually create another scope variable, and we're going to call that new post. And this is what's going to basically contain our, we're going to model this to our form right here. So what we'll need right now is we'll need a name And we'll also need some text, basically the text of that chirp. So let's go and initialize that real quick. I'm going to call the username created by, make that empty for now.
You probably don't need those vars, right?
No, but it's nice to know what you're, it's just, I think, a good practice to say, hey, what is going to actually be used? Yeah. And actually, because we're going to use ng model later on, we want to specifically tie, for instance, the text the text box for your name specifically to a new post created by, for instance. So as soon as that changes, this is actually going to change. And you'll actually, by adding it in here, you'll actually also know exactly what models you're going to use explicitly. So it makes for cleaner code, I think, to initialize it here, even if you don't necessarily need to. I'm also going to initialize text. And I'm going to do something else. I am going to actually create it at. Because as you've seen in Twitter, and as you're going to see in our application, we want some timestamps. And so the created at is basically going to store a timestamp. I'm going to leave that empty for now, but that's all we'll really need here. So now let's actually go through and add each of these scope variables and attach them as models here. When I say each, I actually do not mean we should do the timestamp as well. We're actually just going to do the created by on the your name text input, and I'm going to call that, or I'm going to use ng model, and I'm going to use new post dot created by. And you'll notice that I'm actually not using scope here, whereas I use scope here. And that's because this entire scope is already passed to this controller. And the only things it can access are just basically scope variables. So you could just call them by what you named them here.
Scope is implicitly
defined. Scope is implicitly defined. And for the text area, we're going to do something similar. We're going to do ng model, and we're just going to give it new post dot text. I'm actually going to also set this input up here for the name as required real quick. So now that we have these two, what are we actually going to do when this form posts? Well, we need to add in the post here to the form. And for and just for timing purposes, I'm actually going to paste the rest of this in. So what we're going to use is we're going to use ng submit for the form posting, and it'll basically call a post function. And in here, we're going to create another. Let me just go down here, paste that in as well. We're going to create a post function on our scope so that it can actually be called in our application here. I'm gonna indent this a little bit better so you could see. But what we're doing in our form is we're calling ng submit post. So whenever this form, whenever the submit button on this form is clicked, it's actually going to call this post function. And so we then define that post function actually on our scope as well. So the scope will be a function that basically creates or adds a created at to the new post here. So whereas before it was blank and we didn't necessarily change it in our model at all, we're actually going to change that here and make that date.now, which is essentially going to be the current timestamp. And then we're actually going to post this, or push this to posts. We're going to take whatever we created in new post, the actual populated post, and we're going to add that into our scopes.post. And then we're going to reset new post here. So once we save this, you'll notice that we actually don't display the chirp feed here at all. And we're going to display that in just 1 minute. We're going to display that using our basically filters. Or actually, I don't think I'm supposed to do this.
That's what we're at. Yeah. That's what I was asking about.
Yeah, sorry. OK. So once we add this in here, we should actually be able to post into our posts array. Now, we're going to just actually be able to see our post array if we actually display it here. So let's go in and create that display. So we're going to display this pretty primitively right now, just by creating a div. And what we're going to use this interesting ng repeat directive using some filtering.